as the moderator of the conference public forum today. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the introduction. Continuing with yesterday, we see many members in the audience today as well. As an organizer, I would first like to express our heartfelt appreciation for your attendance. And first, I would like to make a request to protect our conference. We face common enemy. This common enemy is the virus spreading of the virus. We must not lend our hand in the spread of the virus. So please keep space in between, and please use the disinfectant at the entrance, and refrain from handshaking as much as possible, and wear surgical masks. Today, there are many who could not come today, and so everything will be streamed online, and I would like to ask for your understanding of that as well. This coronavirus outbreak that began in China is spreading not only in Japan but throughout the world. And in Japan, there is a growing trend of cancellation and postponement of events and activities. The government of Japan is also taking various actions, and even yesterday, there were cancellations of attendance by Japanese government representatives and overseas participants at this Tokyo conference. And this is quite unfortunate. Former German federal president, Mr. Wolf, also decided not to come. However, we have received a video message in view of the importance of this conference. And Mr. Wolf also would like to attend the next conference. So we received a video message which we would like to share later. So in the world, to come to Japan requires much courage. So participation in a conference in Japan is now difficult. Despite these difficulties, Mr. Vedrin, former French minister, and Mr. Hassan, former Indonesian foreign minister, have come to Japan just to attend this conference. And many of you are attending this conference in this room, and we recognize seriously the significance of your attendance. And yesterday, during the conference, despite these difficulties, we had more than 100 participants, and many were wearing surgical masks, but we had a large number of audience, and it was streamed online. And we have received many comments from viewers that they agree with the discussion advocating that we face and address the world issues. So coronavirus impact is spreading instantaneously throughout the world, multiplying the serious impact. So literally the world is one. However, in the world today, walls are built on the national borders, and there are various confrontations. And now there is a concern of divisions of the world. Yesterday during the conference, the top leaders of the think tanks of the world discussed these very issues. World now must unite to contain the infection. And this problem suggests that there are various challenges that the world faces, which we must think about. International order, international cooperation, and how each country should face the world, and what we must do as citizens. There are many questions raised from the current challenge, and the confrontation between the United States and China is quite serious, and we expect that this to be sustained over a lengthy period of time. As democratic countries, what we must do, what cooperation we must engage in, were discussed yesterday, and we will make proposal or recommendation to the presidency of G7, which is the United States of America this year, and we will also make proposal to the government of Japan. Tokyo conference was started 4 years ago after our proposal from Genron NPO. Genron NPO was established 19 years ago, and no matter how difficult the situation may be, we never ceased our discussion. And this is one of the few unique independent think tank for providing a forum for discussion by intelligentsia and experts in Japan, and world order based on freedom and democracy are becoming quite unstable, and democracy itself is facing difficulty. Multilateralism as well is facing difficulty. So we must not remain silent. We have to address these challenges, and with the think tanks in the world that share the same value of liberty and democracy, we wanted to work together. And that is why Tokyo Conference was started 3 years ago. From the United States, Canada, India, Singapore, and other countries. We have leaders from the think tanks from the United Kingdom and from Brazil. Some could not attend because of the virus situation, but we are in close contact with those as well and obtained agreement on the joint statement. The unity of the 10 think tanks from 10 countries have not wavered, and we would like to fulfill a responsibility by issuing this recommendation. And this will originate from Japan because we also believe that Japan is asked to fulfill its leadership role. So to address world challenges, we believe that Japan should fulfill leadership more, and that is why we are issuing this recommendation from Japan to the world. And we believe that this is a very critical historical juncture where our positions and stance are questioned. And many leaders from the world are saying that they are willing to participate in this movement. Coronavirus is an important test of our effort, but we would like to overcome that test and would like to continue with our discussion. So now we would like to start the second day of the Tokyo conference. I will serve as the master of ceremony today. I would first like to invite Mr. Yasushi Akashi, former Under-Secretary General of the United Nations and member of the Advisory Board of Genron NPO, to give us opening remarks.
Good afternoon, everybody. Since many of the participants come from outside of Japan, allow me to speak in English this afternoon. Mr. Kudo has just told us that we should try not to shake hands with each other. I wonder how we can promote democracy and liberal order without shaking hands. I'm highly honored to welcome you all to this, I believe, concluding session of the Tokyo Conference 2020, which started in Tokyo 4 years ago. I am particularly moved that we are meeting today despite the present global threat of coronavirus, which has already affected, last night I wrote 50 countries. This morning I'm told that 58 countries are affected. Some of you have traveled a very long distance to come to Tokyo to attend this conference. I take note of the presence in our midst of many distinguished guests, of which I know many. I note particularly the presence of Mr. Hassan Wibidara, former Foreign Minister of Indonesia, and Mr. Hubert Védrine, also former Foreign Minister of France. I look forward to hearing many words of wisdom on the very important subject matters which are on our agenda from our guests this afternoon. I believe that the text of the Tokyo Declaration, finalized, I believe, last night, is already available now to all of you. As I understand it, the underlying main thread of the declaration is that the conclusion of our current preoccupations must not be a further splintering of the confrontation in our world, but we should be able to reach a unanimous conclusion that a shared and agreed coexistence, not only by two superpowers, namely the United States and China, but also by the entire world on the question of rule-based community of nations. The basic component of our consensus reflected in the Tokyo Declaration, so far as I understand, is that the United States and other G4 countries should continue their joint endeavors for agreed liberal order. At the same time, China is asked to accept our responsibility in the world market. Another general target would be a G7 leadership in digital and other new growing areas in order to ensure extensive multilateral cooperation. At the same time, this new Tokyo Declaration does not ignore the clear need for more national and international effort to strengthen and work against authoritarianism and populism. I'm particularly happy to read a very strong affirmation in the 5th paragraph of the declaration on the responsibility of the intelligentsia and media. I conclude my brief opening remark by saying that I'm very hopeful that this year's Tokyo Declaration is right on target and deserves our full endorsement from now into our common future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Akashi. Now, we have wise men of the world with us today, and originally more were scheduled to attend. We went around the world to share our idea, and there were many who were surprised that Japan is trying to take such initiative, and we have received many letters saying that it's difficult to attend this time, but they would like to attend the next time. So there are many who are willing to support these initiatives. And so we are scheduled to have 3 speeches. Unfortunately, one could not come in physical presence, but 2 are with us. And former Federal President of Germany, Mr. Wolf, he deeply regretted that he could not come, but he wanted to convey his message. So we would like to have his video message first.
Sehr geehrter Herr Kudo, meine sehr
Mr. Kudo, ladies and gentlemen, I am so delighted to have exchange of views with all of you on the very important issue of strengthening the cooperation for democracy. I would like to express my appreciation for the tremendous commitment by all of you. But because of the government's notice on her gathering, as well as my own position, I was not able to participate in person, unfortunately. So I would like to make 6 points in my video message. Firstly, the future is still open. We need to understand that. The assumption which is often taken up at certain intervals is that the history has ended, the end of history. Hegel has seen that in Prussia, in the bureaucratic state, and Francis Fukuyama has seen that in the liberal democracy. But both were wrong, and they are still wrong. The future is still open. Nobody can say for sure what will happen 20 years from now, 30 years from now, or even 100 years from now. What will happen to the livelihood in Japan or Europe? How will the AI play out its role in our life? Nobody can say for sure. And as the state is more stable and more participatory, we cannot really say for sure that preconditions would be more favorable. Constantly, the history has demonstrated that authoritarian the government may not be dynamic, and they are unstable, and they are not to be trusted. Democracy, on the other hand, must be dynamic because the preconditions are always evolving and changing. And every society in their own circumstances need to think about the liberal democracy, and each generation need to renew and refresh democracy. Willy Brandt, the former Chancellor and Nobel Peace Laureate, has said that everything cannot go smoothly. It is very rare that the stability will continue forever. So what we need to be aware of is that there is no required answer, which is just one. In order to bring about the positive changes, we need to be knowledgeable on the latest circumstances. Big change needs excellent ideas. The certainty is lost, is what people say. Even the President of the United States say that truth is negotiable. What can be foreseen is that digitalization will shake the very foundation of the democracy. We see such examples in the United States, the UK, Brazil, and elsewhere. And for the new opportunity for participation, how to be responded, democratic people need to think thoroughly. 5 centuries ago, Martin Luther had utilized the state-of-art printing technology and changed the Christian world. And today, the same change is happening because and now that the people are able, through the social media, to directly participate in the public the discourse. Just as during the Luther's times, people were able to read the Bible directly, no longer have to depend upon the clergy. But possibility of the participation is being actually abused. There are people who will utilize to their own personal profit and interests. We are slowly beginning to understand that there are people who are actually manipulating the situation. The election campaign by Donald Trump, as well as President Bolsonaro of Brazil, how he's fighting with the human rights defenders, and also the national referendum which took place in UK for Brexit. The people have to have the will to rule. Democracy is ruled by the people. If you look back into the history of Germany in the 1920s, if people does not want to rule and is not active in democracy, you understand what happens because the radicalism would increase in its power. They would be in tactical advantage. Even though the world have different shades of gray, everything is painted as black or white. Even they do not have the answers for the imminent problems. So people will discover that soon. The economic crisis and for massive unemployment, and today it is more of climate change and digitalization. These people actually use the anxieties of the ordinary people as catalysts and try to abuse the power. The only way to respond would be to have multifocal viewpoints and have the will to stand up and have a voice to be spoken. Democrats, when we are not able to function, if we are too weak and if we are too hesitant, things will go against us. What we need to recognize, now is the time to defend the liberal democracy. We cannot wait and do nothing. Dictatorship may be the world that we would awaken eventually. Democracy will not alert us when it disappears. Everyone needs to exert its responsibility. And we need to utilize the every state-of-art communication methods to counter the authoritarian moves. The essential memory is to be kept fresh. Unfortunately, unless there's a catastrophe, people were not able to collaborate with others to achieve the peace and the development. From 1918 onwards, there was League of Nations, and also the German France rapprochement was brought about by the Stresemann and Briand. From 1945 onwards, we had the United Nations as well as NATO, and also European Union came into being. And we have seen the big successful peace project ongoing. In the learning process, never again, there was the slogan, no more Verdun, no more Auschwitz, no more Stalingrad. This is the message from the generation after the Second World War. Very few people are still alive who have experienced the Second World War. They have keenly felt the nationalism and anti-Semitism could cause all the dire results and racial discrimination as well. They have seen the abyss. Fortunately, our generation who are living in the European Union today had not have had to go through such an experience. But people, especially the younger generation, have forgotten how bloody the process was to bring forth the peace. And there are people saying that if you join hands with the populism, then their phony and bogus situation will become clear.
It reminds us of 1933, described about Nazism. Many of the people were indifferent, had given up about democracy, and already there was a sign that it is going to be catastrophic after the persecution of the Jewish and the abolition of democracy in Germany. This should never happen again. We must stand firm against all enemies of democracy from the left to the right. This is what we have to deal with. My fifth point. Patriotism is good for all countries, is important, but nationalism causes catastrophe. When people join the bandwagon of populists and they are attracted by ever so simple solution, that is because when the world changes dramatically, people are losing something to depend on. When local colors and characteristics are lost, people are becoming worried to find the place of belonging. The key to the solution to that anxiety is identity and homeland. People want to have a sense that they belong to a locality, to a land. Becoming a patriot and to be proud of your homeland is all right. However, what is important is there must be a clear demarcation between a benign patriotism and dangerous nationalism. What is important is not to be arrogant and haughty over the others, but to have patriotism that has empathy and sympathy. Within the inner realm, there must be ample space to accept diverse identities, but to the outside world, to the others, there must be a peaceful attitude towards all the other patriots who like their own nations. Diversity and acceptance is important inside. Across the world, due to globalization, digitalization, naturally the world is becoming even more diverse. That is why, in order to deal with diversity, the next 2 points have to be kept in mind. First of all, tolerance is a fine foundation, but that is not enough. In each of the community, there must be larger level of effort to mutually understand each other, and once rules are decided by the community, these must be enforced and implemented without exception. This allows the realization of the coexisting in diversity. Diversity is a value that causes innovation, and the culture of healthy discussion and debate also has a value to create the necessary transformation. My last 6th point, to understand the indispensability of cooperation. What is necessary to the outside is the characteristic of good diplomacy and the effort of finding common vision to understand the position of other, to respect the other, and to deal with equality and equity with other. I think this is the most deficient aspect as of today. There is a way of thinking that thinking about yourself alone and thinking about your country alone would mean that the conclusion would lead to the contribution of positive ideas for all the people and all the nation. This is dangerous. This way of thinking caused a catastrophe in the prelude to World War I, and we must counter this force, whether it be current American diplomacy, strategies of China and Russia, or whether China's movement in this region. We must counter this. There must be active communication of people, philosophy, goods, and service. Media should not cause a division. There must be support to the media so that the commonality can be emphasized. BBC, TV5, Deutsche Welle, Euronews, these media do not try to profit during the dispute of others. They warrant support. What is important is not to forget the memory of 1918 and 1945. What is important is to avoid closed-door diplomacy and to strengthen the United Nations, NATO, and others. After all, what is clear is, no matter how strong a country might look like, no single country can resolve all the global challenges for humankind. There is no other way but to collaborate and work with each other. Otherwise, challenges cannot be overcome. Which means nationalism is totally useless in order to overcome today's challenges. In order to grow the world economy, there must be common effort to expand free trade. At the same time, to overcome sustainability of debt crisis, ethically correct monetary economic policies are required, which means strengthening WTO, World Bank, and other international organizations are included, but there are challenges. This is China, which is an authoritarian capitalism country and trying to be a hegemon, competing with the United States, how to engage China, or how to create partnership with Africa, how to think about a framework where it would be in the interest of all stakeholder countries and that no one will lose. How to mediate between conflicts or maintain the peace or in area of counterterrorism. There must be common and effective tools. In particular, strengthening of the United Nations is important. This is most important in climate change, renewable energy expansion, sustainability, or the protection of the sea and tropical forests. Collaboration is required. As you know, the younger generation are advocating there is no time to be lost. Digitalization are spreading across the border. We have to work together and deal with the issue of new engagement. There must be respect, a sense of security, and the people need to be engaged. The convenience of digitalization must be explicit in all areas in order to deal with declining birth rate and aging society. Digital technology must be used not only in infrastructure but in re-education, continuous education, in the investment of human capital. Ladies and gentlemen, in the Hanseatic city of Lübeck, Germany, there is an inscription on Holsten Gate, the words also mentioned by Kemal Atatürk, the founder of Turkey. This, I believe, is still valid in the 21st century. Unity at home and peace abroad. Concordia Domi Foris Pax.
Thank you very much. I will not share my impressions. I'm sure you all each have impression from the speech. Next, I would like to invite Mr. Hassan, former Foreign Minister of Indonesia, to deliver his speech.
Thank you, Kudo-san. Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. In 2015, Richard Haas of the U.S. Council of Foreign Relations published a book titled "A World in Disarray." When Donald Trump came to power in 2016 and voted a slogan, "America First," since then our world is becoming more disarray. So what we need is more than just updating or repairing the existing global order, but rather promoting major reform, which is more fundamental restructuring of the existing global order. Under the policy of America First, President Trump has a distaste of multilateralisms. It was said yesterday by a panelist that promoting multilateralisms of the world order is not his priority missions. America First policy eventually works at the expense of multilateralisms. Instead, it chooses bilateralism in advancing the U.S. global interests. A clear example of Washington's abrupt withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnerships, TPP, and other regional free trade agreements such as NAFTA, Transatlantic FTA, Paris Agreements on Climate Change, and the Human Rights Council. Eventually, it works at the expense of global or liberal order. On peace and security, the existing world order has survived for nearly 75 years, following its inception from the ashes of World War II. But it is rapidly outdated because its failure to keep up with a fast-changing world, highlighting the need for reform. But before we discuss about changes of the world order, let us recall some basic principles behind them. In order to promote international cooperation based on the United Nations Charter, therefore, world order based on rules. Measures such as war was outlawed or prohibited by the UN Charter, except in self-defense. This contrasts with the covenant of the League of Nations, which allowed for just wars. On peace and security, the existing world order is based on collective responsibility, unlike the collective security of the League of Nations. The great powers in both organizations, in the case of the UN, 5 permanent members of the Security Council, are required to exercise greater responsibility by promoting consultations and cooperation among themselves. The Council of Europe was able to maintain a European-based world orders for about 100 years through close consultations and among the continent's great powers. Their failures to maintain close consultations and cooperation, and for that matter, balance of power, led to World War I. In practice, relations among permanent Security Council members contradicted these principles. During the Cold War, which
lasted for 41 years, from 1948 to 1989, the lack of cooperation among the great powers rendered the United Nations Security Council ineffective. Things were seen from the perspective of ideological divisions and bloc politics, rather than from its own merits. For more than 2 decades, in the wake of the end of the Cold War, we have witnessed the rise of globalizations, which strengthens multilateralism. During the first decades of the end of the Cold War, the world experienced summit fatigue, as so much summit was held during that time. In mid-1990s, summits on UN reform was held, as well as its successive summits. China back then was still rising and was not a factor in the discussions of the future of global order. Following 9/11, the United States shifted to act unilaterally. This stance undermined multilateralism. Multilateralism was again eroded by the lack of cooperation and consultations among the permanent members of the Security Council. Tensions between the US and Russia, for example, are also heightened by the Russia-Ukraine war in 2014 and the ensuing annexations of Crimea by Russia. The lack of consultations and, in fact, strong disagreements among major powers is key to the UN Security Council failure to carry out its mission for the maintenance of international peace and security. In the case of proxy war in Syria and Yemen, the UN Security Council didn't even hold a single meeting to stop the hostilities. China and Russia opposed the discussion in the Security Council at the beginning of the Syrian conflict because they didn't want, and I quote, to be cheated again by the West, as allegedly happened in the case of Libyan conflict. During that conflict, the UN Security Council adopted a resolution in 2011 to impose a no-fly zone, a message that was misused to launch a war and promoted a regime change in Libya. It is interesting to note that in the absence of effective global order on peace and security and the lack of regional order in the Middle East, nation states became failed states or becoming failing states. The success of Deng Xiaoping's modernization policy by promoting reform and openness, for that matter, brought spectacular economic rise of China, and it got the attention of the world in the early 2000s when China took over Japan as the second largest economy. With it, modernized its military. There is an uncomfortable comparison between the rise of China and the rise of Germany, which preceded World War I. President Trump sees China as a strategic competitor, no longer as a partner as viewed by the earlier administrations, Obama, for example. Last year, the United States launched a trade war against China, which has exacerbated the relationship between two competing powers. Normally, disputes over tariffs, for example, are referred to the World Trade Organization, WTO, dispute settlement mechanism. Ominously, US National Security Advisor then John Bolton once threatened to dismantle the WTO. The US seemed to follow up Bolton's word as it rejected the appointments of WTO appellate judges and rendering the organization trade by rules stands ineffective. On attempts to reform the world order, there has been attempts to reform the United Nations, including the UN Security Council. I participated in the UN Reform Summit in 1995 and the following summits, including those raising the possibility of expanding the UN Security Council memberships. I came to the conclusions that not only that UN reform has failed, but it seems impossible. As often happens throughout the history, major reforms often comes after major war. Following the collapse of the Roman Empire in the beginning of the 17th century, followed by 30 years war of Europe, which some 25 or 30% of Europeans' population perish. Then a Westphalian system was adopted in 1648, which has become the foundations of successive world orders. World War I resulted in the establishment of the League of Nations based on its covenant, which was a correction of the previous Westphalian system of 1648. World War II brought about the establishment of the United Nations and a new liberal world order based on the UN Charter in 1945. So it took a crisis to change, whether we like it or not. But should we wait for a third world war to reform the existing world order? Perhaps not. With over 15,000 nuclear weapons or warheads put on high alert, a third global war would cause the extinctions of human beings on Earth. Perhaps only Jeff Bezos of Amazon and Elon Musk of Tesla, who would save themselves in the planet Mars. On the economic front, the UN ECOSOC, Economic, Social and Economic Council, was curtailed from its inception as the US and its Western allies established the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, and the IFC, in anticipation of the ideological war between the capitalized free market system and the socialist centrally planned economic system. Following the global financial crisis of 2008, the Bretton Woods system was deemed inadequate, hence the establishment of the G20. At the London G20 summit, which I attended, there was an agreement to reform the Bretton Woods institutions, but since then, the reform is unheard of. The rise of populations and narrow nationalism brought about the decline of democracy, and it hinders multilateralisms. Established democracies such as those in the European Union are struggling to reconcile the values of democracy and human rights with the rise of right-wing politics, as well as the anti-immigrations and fear-mongering rhetoric that carries in their wake. Equally worrying is that new democracies are being threatened by creeping authoritarianisms and their failure to deliver economic justice. Sadly, we cannot expect much from both established and new democracies to uphold the global liberal order. All democracies, advanced as well as young and emerging democracies, are facing great challenges to prove to their own people that democracy works in terms of creating prosperity, peace and security, as well as social justice. In conclusion, successive attempts to reform the existing world order's political and security and economic structure have failed because reform inevitably means a redistribution of power. And those privileged tend to resist change that led to the redistributions of the powers that they have acquired. The rise of China as global power needs to be taken into account in the future global system. China has a rightful place in the new world order, comparable to its new status as a global superpower. Psychologically, of course, this is not easy to take for the old superpower. I shared the view by Dr. Henry Kissinger that the absence of an agreed world order, the future global order, would comprise of a totality of regional orders. But this is not an easy option. The European Union, often referred to as the most successful regional organization, is now facing serious difficulties. Brexit, political division between the continent's sub-regions, and the threat of right-wing politics. Not to mention how EU would reconcile its European values of democracy and human rights with increasing right-wing politics, populisms, and micro-nationalisms, as well as all the phobias. In East Asia, the establishment of East Asia Summit in 2015 was meant to be a vehicle towards the creation of an East Asia community. For various reasons, the East Asian region have yet to establish its own community, and for that matter, regional order. Unsettled legacies of the previous wars and the prospect of nuclear weapons proliferations have handicapped good neighborly relations. To bolster the slow process of community building in East Asia, we might consider linking 5 democratic countries, all members of the G20, namely India, the first largest democracy, Indonesia, the 3rd largest, Japan, an advanced democracy, South Korea, and Australia. We may call this process of established and emerging democracy democratic convergence. As such, democratic convergence should strive for the promotions of rigorous promotion of East Asia-wide regional democratic constituents to strengthen the regional order and eventually the global liberal order. I thank you very much.
Mr. Hassan, thank you very much. Next, from France, former French foreign minister. He's regarded highly as a wise person. Mr. Hubert Védrine. I would like to invite Mr. Védrine to speak. And the speech will be delivered in French, so please make use of the interpretation equipment.
Ladies and gentlemen, I will speak in French.
I will speak in French.
Je commencerai.
First, what I would like to say at the outset is that I'm very happy to be here in Tokyo. I will only be here for a number of hours because the initiative of this conference, because I consider this conference to be very important, the initiative and the theme to be important. Democracies around the world are in rivalry, and they have to take on a big challenge. President Trump, his policies and the rise of China, Russia, there are many realities that we have to face. So when we think about this topic, I think it is a very appropriate time. In Europe, the media, and at various conferences in Europe, I don't think enough attention is being paid. They're not paying enough attention to the insight that was given birth to in Japan. This conference has a very interesting position, which is very important for Europe, and therefore we need to share what we have considered. First, I would like to conduct some diagnosis, and then thereafter, what can we do? I would like to think about what we can do about this theme. First, let me start with diagnosis. Multilateralism. We should not idealize multilateralism. Yes, I am for multilateralism, but international relations over the past 10 years, in the recent 10 years, it's not that it has been based solely on multilateralism. Japan and Germany have been making special efforts to take the multilateral approach, not to fall into the tendency of putting one's country first. In France or in the UK, it's the same. Prior to President Trump, it was the same in the United States. There was a shock coming from President Trump. His style was quite shocking. Previously, in the United States, it was idealized. During the Clinton days, the US was quite open, he was quite democratic, and he had ideals. He was an idealist. For Americans, multilateralism that Americans could follow, he had such an ideal. So with our allies, well, this is what President Clinton said, working together with the allies to solve problems. But if it proves to be impossible, then he will try to manage and solve the problem on his own, unilaterally, by the United States. So multilateralism, we shouldn't consider that multilateralism has gone. Its golden days are behind us, especially in the area of strategy. There has been a dominant discourse, especially centering around the international community. There was a certain discourse. It's better to explore, to find a solution together. But with the rise of President Trump, that approach was eliminated. If you conduct analysis of politics, it's not the case that Mr. Trump is always wrong. Sometimes he's correct. He's probably more correct on the issues of China. But the US has abandoned the previous discourse. His words are more crude and raw, and that style has been adopted by Mr. Trump. He says that he will choose to do what he wants to do at the time of his choosing, putting himself first. Me first attitude has been adopted by President Trump. That's the signature behavior pattern of President Trump. Whether he will be re-elected or not, we don't know. That possibility is not zero, which means that over the next 5 years, he will continue to serve as President of the United States. Then, if his behavior pattern is to leave some kind of the impact, even if he is not to be re-elected, the US will not revert back to the days before Trump presidency. His style of politics will continue, and it will have repercussions. His influence will remain. Another analysis or diagnosis. Democracy wants to protect liberal order, but we are aware of problems of democracy. That may not be so clearly visible in Japan, but European countries, as well as the US and Canada, populism, Well, the public is not believing globalization anymore because globalization was not good for them. For the Chinese, globalization may be good, but the public, the general public in Europe, they are not believing in the development of European Union. Even in the middle class, they don't believe in it. And there's this response of populism. This term is agony. And among the voters, there was some suffering. And they have this sense that they have lost something. Democracy, it's important to converge around liberal order. The final result of a diagnosis: capitalism, finance, Wall Street Journal of the United States. What we can read from there is that globalization came very suddenly, and on the social aspects, it was too harsh. There has been wealth gap created, which was too huge. Those are some of the views expressed. So this global economy has become financial, and this is not about authoritarianism. In this system, in the system of liberal order, there are problems. So this much has been my diagnosis. Now, what can we do to this? Let us think about what we can do about this. In liberal order, there are some deficiencies, many deficiencies. But compared to the systems before, that was tested before, this is better still. So what can we do? I don't have any magic answer, but let me propose a certain method. First, what we need to do is, what can we do without Trump? Maybe we should list up what we can do without Trump. For example, environmental protection. Over the next few years, this is going to be one of the most important issues. This hasn't been looked at too closely in the past. We had been too ignorant, or we have been turning a blind eye to this problem in the past. But right now, the problem is being recognized, and in Europe, as well as in the United States, in certain regions, to environmental destruction, there is a panic situation arising. So the first method would be, we will think about what can be done without Trump, involving certain segments of the society of the United States. When we talk about environmental protection, it's not just about climate change. There's the issue of waste or biodiversity. Over the past few decades, there are many problems that make our lives difficult. And in the United States, in the state of California, or corporations, or researchers, there are many who are working on this issue. So we need to deal with these environmental issues, which would require scientific knowledge. Many stakeholders in the United States could be involved to deal with this issue. Mr. Trump is not interested in environmental problems, or even if he denies that such a problem exists. Solar energy batteries, if that was invented in the United States, even Mr. Trump may change his position. So we will first have to think about what we can do without the involvement of Mr. Trump. It's not just in the area of environmental protection, sanitation, health is another area we can seek international collaboration. Coronavirus is a big topic now, but for other diseases, we need to have international cooperation. That is essential. And within the framework of United Nations, in special organs of the United Nations. There are many things that we can work together. Next, despite the existence of President Trump, or even in confrontation with Mr. Trump, there are certain things that we can do. All democracies do not agree on everything, but Europeans or French people, what we want to think about as Europeans is this nuclear agreement with Iran. This was negotiated during the Obama days, and President Obama to Iran, there was this perpetual sanctions. Despite those sanctions, Iran continued to develop nuclear weapons. As a French person, I support nuclear power, but Iran was making it for military use. And there was an agreement reached, but Mr. Trump decided to leave this agreement, which is ridiculous. We can say that it is ridiculous. But the problem is Mr. Trump tries to impede other countries from abiding by this agreement. This is a problem that existed before Trump. The United States applying sanctions to foreign countries. This has been a problem from decades before, and those countries that suffered from those sanctions are placed in great difficulty. The global economy has become financial and dollarized, so the sanctions do have huge impacts. Liberal order or multilateralism, even if you talk about the benefits of these principles, because of these sanctions, on the issues of these sanctions, you need to restore the balance. You need to convince and persuade the United States to become more rational, to become more practical. We need to try to persuade the U.S. to follow such a course. Even if the U.S. decides on those sanctions, imposing or coercing other countries to toe the line should be avoided. These are sanctions that were decided in the United States for their national considerations, so the countries around the world do not have to follow the U.S. line. Now let me go back to the topic of ecology or the environment. Mr. Trump is very passive and negative, not so active and positive about these issues, but in certain instances, for those areas where we cannot have a compromise with Mr. Trump, we need to confront the U.S. For example, towards the end of this year, there is going to be a biodiversity conference to be held in China. How do we work together with China? Because China is the host country, symbolically, they will at least make efforts to do something. So what can we do together? Even at the expense of confronting the U.S. stance, we have to think about what we can do together. Of course, it's not that we will always collide with the United States. We don't want to see a situation where we're always in dispute with the United States. But democracies, under this liberal order, we need to have democracies to converge. Then we have to be resolved to have some kind of a tense relationship with the United States. I'm not saying that we should collide with the United States, have a dispute with them all the time, but in order to save this liberal democracy or liberal order, on a certain number of issues, there is going to be tension with the United States over a number of issues. Yes, we need to compromise, but even after making compromises, we may still be in dispute with the United States. And there's the issue of China. Japan is very sensitive to this issue of China. But there are certain areas where we can work with China And there are certain areas where there could be agreement excluding US and China. The strategic challenge is so huge. So I don't think there's going to be any strategic deal to be reached between the US and China. The US wants to be number one all the time, and by 2049, China aspires to be number one in the world. So these are these two countries aiming to and wishing to be number one. So there's not likely to be any compromise to be reached between these two countries. But in certain instances, between the US and China, there could be a truce to be reached. For Japan and Europe, what is important is that China, once they reach a truce deal, we have to make sure that we would not fall victim to that truce. There could be many tactics that could be followed. At every instance, whatever compromise or tension between China and US should be used for our advantage. We want to have reciprocity. President Macron, on China policy, he's talking about reciprocity. How do you ensure reciprocity? It's not that China will be given a special treatment. Deng Xiaoping, ever since those days, China has followed remarkable modernization compared to the Meiji Restoration of Japan. Chinese modernization and transformation was about 100 times greater, but a more balanced position. If you want China to go back to a more balanced position, then in the areas of economy and technology, or in the areas of strategy or environmental protection, Europe, Canada, and Japan, and other countries. How can we involve these countries, including emerging countries? How are we going to work together? That is the big challenge. It's not that I have any solution at hand, but I'm just making a proposal as one method. Now let me go into my conclusion. Multilateralism, declaration to protect and advocate multilateralism, to advocate liberal order, that is useful, but declarations themselves are not sufficient. This is what I want to emphasize. It is true that we have to look for areas where we can come up with concrete results. Public opinion around the world or in emerging countries, there may be public opinion. Former Foreign Minister of Indonesia has said that countries like India, such countries' public opinion is demanding results. Multilateralism is like a religion. There's no point in talking about multilateralism as a religion. It has to be something that yields results, to produce results. President Xi and President Trump, when such leaders exist in today's world, we are confronted with a challenge. It's not just an external challenge. Domestically as well, we do have a challenge. You need to restore the support of the domestic people. Accusing authoritarianism may not be sufficient. We need to speak to the domestic audience to tell them that the democracy is the best system. Ethically and morally, democracy is the best system. We need to build such a consensus. On this issue, Europe, OECD countries, Canada, and Japan the consensus amongst these countries will not be sufficient. We need to include emerging countries in forming such a consensus. Those countries that are aspiring to become democracies must be included in this endeavor. Yes, we're living in difficult times today. Looking back in the past, 1945, it's not just a matter of reviewing what happened in 1945. I have just shared with you my thoughts at this moment. French language was translated into Japanese ones and then into English. I thank you for your attention.
ベドリーヌさん、本当に
Thank you very much, Mr. Vedrine. He arrived this morning just for this conference, and he will be leaving soon. Thank you very much. I express my gratitude. Whether the democracy will be able to protect and preserve the international liberal order, that is not the question. What we are trying to discuss is how can we make this happen? The significance and relevance of what is happening today, the timing of this. I believe there was very appropriate advice and recommendations given to the three speakers. Once again, a big applause. Thank you. Thank you for waiting, ladies and gentlemen. We would now like to have the panel discussion. Let me very briefly introduce the panelists. From your very right, we have President Kudo from Genron NPO. And seated next to him is the former Japanese ambassador to the United States and currently the member of the advisory board of Genron NPO, Ambassador Fujisaki. And next to him is from Singapore. We have Ambassador Ong Keng-yon, who is the head of RSIS. And seated next to him is Dr. James Lindsay, the Senior Vice President of the CFR from the United States. And from India, we have Dr. Sanjoy Joshi. He is the head of the Observer Research Foundation. And we also have Dr. Volker Peltes from SWP in Germany. We will also have Mr. Vedrine as well as Mr. Virayuda to be the participants in the panel discussion as well. And we would like to ask Dr. Rohinto Medora, the President of the Center for International Governance Innovation of Canada, to be the moderator.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this beautiful spring day in Tokyo. The marathon's just over, and we start another one now on a slightly different note and different subject. I'd like to begin, though, by thanking Kudo-san and his colleagues at Genron NPO for bringing us all together these past few years on the subject of the global liberal order and the fact that it might be fraying, the fact that it has to be refreshed, and that we have to refresh it at the same time that new challenges and opportunities keep coming our way, as our three keynote speakers reminded us. The theme of our discussions this year was effectively the risk of decoupling. The fact that the US and China are the preeminent powers globally, they increasingly do not see eye to eye. And as we were reminded in many of our discussions, there tend to be zero-sum game aspects to their dealings. Where does that leave them? Where does that leave the rest of the world? And so that's going to be the nature of our discussion with our keynote speakers and my colleagues from the think tank community and our hosts from Japan. We will sort of I want to outline three guiding questions that we will use in the next 90 minutes or so to animate this discussion. I guess the first would be, what might be the way or ways out from this increasingly confrontational relationship between the US and China? Second, is it possible for the US and China to coexist, if not peacefully, at least in a way that is stabilizing rather than destabilizing? And then I guess third, and especially relevant to most of us in the room and on this panel, what is the role of other major democracies if, in fact, US leadership is weakening and China is not a democracy and the rising power? And so there's a set of very challenging questions, and I'd like to begin with our two keynote speakers. And if it's okay with you, Mr. Vedrine, pick up where you left off on the questions of the fact that multilateralism cannot be a dogma. On the other hand, it is the only thing we have. It's better than most of the alternatives. You were not especially optimistic about the US-China relationship and how it will play off. But I would like to ask you if you could sort of give us your views on that relationship, sort of deepen the points you made in your keynote on what are the friction points, what might be the ways forward, and especially what role for other countries like France and Germany and indeed Canada and Japan to find a way out.
Je continue.
I will continue in French. I hope there is the translation in 2 stages. This is a very complicated question. I will need a few minutes. That is because the rivalry, confrontation between the US and China this issue will be the dominant issue in the next decade or so. It is not going to be over in 4 years or so. Other countries, including Europe, Canada, and Japan, Australia, the other democracies or emerging democracies for other countries must be proactive and anticipatory. When China finds it necessary to join hands with others, or when US decides to agree with other countries, that timing has to be discovered. Meanwhile, to prepare and to anticipate, to protect the interest of each and every party. In order to establish international rules, China and the US must be engaged. I'm not sure whether the word shock is appropriate, but genuine policies and politics will be required. Real politics. So we must be proactive, and we have to prepare for the weakness of China and the weakness of the United States. These have to be anticipated. But then, amongst the other democracies, there must be minimum level of agreement at least, and of course collaboration and cooperation are required. emerging democracies, they must agree to a certain degree. And if that agreement is established, US and China going too far or becoming extreme might be prevented. However, at the moment, there are no common points that could be some reference, and therefore, in a couple of areas, possible cooperations or agreements must be explored. Otherwise, China's control or the American control or the control and dominance of the two countries will be imposed upon ourselves.
Wirajuta, I'd like to ask the same set of questions to you, but with this additional thought that in your talk, you alluded a lot, and rightly so, to history, the Consort of Europe and so on. And all of those examples you gave were ones where you had groups of, if not dissimilar, certainly countries at different levels of power. The G20 was created, which now includes your country and India and emerging powers, precisely in that same spirit. And so I would ask you that question again with a view to saying, with countries like yours around the big table, should we be more hopeful?
Thank you. In my speech, I expressed a rather pessimistic view of possible reform of the existing world order, though in absence of a possible widely shared order, the future of world order should comprise of a totality of regional orders. In other words, we should anticipate that this current battle for world order may still takes time. If President Trump is elected, we should anticipate that the longer the problems of two superpowers, United States and China, may continue to compete. In fact, what is called trade war is just a beginning, because there were some examples of possible compromise recently. Following trade war would be war on market access, on IPR, and other technology. So what should we do? Number one is to strengthen each regional order. Number two, the major powers should strive hard to reconcile the US and China and continue to work towards a restructuring of global order. Well, on G20, there are established democracies as well as emerging, but likewise advanced economies and emerging economies in a single forum. I think first, in light with the nature of the forum as a global forum for consultations on global economic policy, the emerging power should work towards the more open trade system, open economy, and prevent protectionisms as part and parcels of the existing trade war and further wars between the United States and China. For smaller states and weak states, of course, when two elephants make love, the grass will be trampled. Likewise, when the two elephants got conflicts, the grass will be trampled. And in other words, it is a pity for the rest of the humanity if the two world powers are in conflict. So I think world advanced and emerging democracies should also closely work together rather than ignoring each other. I think the world democracies as a constituents should be able to reach out to each other rather than ignoring each other. And because our challenges are the same, how to prove to our people that democracy works, how democracy works in advanced society, but likewise in the developing countries. And the most difficult in light of the conflict within the US and China is to prove to our people that they have access to economic benefits. Thank you.
I'd like to now turn to my think tank colleagues and start with James Lindsay from one of the elephantine countries that you were referring to, Council on Foreign Relations in the US. James, traditionally, superpowers worked in concert with their allies. They have actively cultivated their allies intellectually, financially, and otherwise, which added to their strength. And I get the impression we now have a situation in which not just the US, I suspect China too, but especially the US, as I'm sure you hear all the time, seems to not value its allies. On the other hand, the US agenda has, at least in the post-war era, been served by having allies on board. Could you talk a bit about whether you think the US is actively disassociating from allies, or is it just a different style?
Thank you for that question, Rohinton. Since you come from Canada, which shares a very long undefended border with the United States, and since we are allies, can I ask you to answer the question you just posed? Is that fair?
After you.
After me, okay. I think it is quite clear that President Trump, with his policy of America first, has a different approach to international relations and America's role in the world than any American president since the end of World War II and the creation of the order that we're talking about. President Trump campaigned on a platform that argued, in essence, that that order was cheating the United States, that America's friends and allies, first and foremost, were using that order to take American jobs and then to free ride off of American security guarantees. And that President Trump saw his mission not as reinvigorating the liberal international order, but making sure the United States got a better deal. And I think that philosophy, that diagnosis, which I don't share, but it is the president's diagnosis of the situation, has guided his foreign policy. And it is why he often sees America's closest friends and allies as much of a challenge, if not more than a challenge, than what we might call America's adversaries or America's potential rivals. And I think on that score, what you see, this is an administration that has famously, the president has famously referred to the European Union as a foe. One cannot think of any previous American president who described the world that way. And again, President Trump's worldview has been that the European Union was formed to beat the United States. In essence, his intention is to make sure America gets more wins. And that's why even on simple things like steel and aluminum tariffs, the president invoked a particular clause in U.S. trade law on national security grounds, allowing the United States to impose tariffs on imports from America's closest countries, including Canada. So I think President Trump has a fundamentally different view about what it is that allies offer to the United States. He focuses much more on what he perceives to be the costs as opposed to the benefits.
Thank you. And to take your challenge, I mean, the reason they made me moderator is they did not want to hear my views. But since you asked, I'd say my own sense is that if you look at the substance of what the US administration has called out, and I'd give 4 examples, NAFTA, the need to refresh it, actually makes sense. WTO, the fact that dispute resolution was straying into national sovereignty, defensible point. Military spending among NATO allies, an issue of long-standing among several administrations of different political stripes, again defensible. Calling out China, most Western countries and indeed Asian countries would not disagree. But the nature in which it has been done has been grating. And second, to do all of that while not calling out anything in countries like Russia and Saudi Arabia really is worrisome. So that's my sort of brief answer to your challenge. I'd now like to move to Sanjay Joshi from India and ask the similar question I asked the minister from Indonesia, which is, President Trump has come off what appears to be a successful visit to India. Is this now part of redeveloping allies around a G20 table? Is it something else? And what role do you think India will be playing in helping us see us out through a US-China confrontation?
Thank you. Thank you, Rohinton, for that question. Everyone seems to be agreeing that the world order is in some ways frayed or broken. It may be frayed or broken, and the truth is that this is not something which today you can just reboot. The process by which the world order was dismantled was a slow brick-by-brick process. And I agree in many ways with James also that in many ways Trump is not the cause for this. He may be a symptom of this, a symptom of something which began much before Trump. You just look at the war in Iraq, you look at various other things. Unilateralism, yes, had been growing. The world order had been breaking down. Multilateralism has been breaking down under onslaught for quite some time. Now, how does this need to be refixed? And what are the entities which are going to refix it? We heard Minister Wolf. He gave the example of 1933. Is this back to 1933? No, I don't think so. Because the nature of power has changed. And the nature of power has changed in ways which even the most autocratic governments have to come up and face with. That includes China. The way power today communicates through the onslaught of capital, through technology, is very, very different from what it was many years ago. And every state has to tackle this. And countries like India, countries like the United States of America, democracies, fundamentally, my belief is, are far better equipped as countries to handle the altered nature of power. The renegotiation of power that is taking place all the time within nations is far better negotiated by democracies. So that is where the G20, yes, becomes very important. India is a democracy. Japan is a democracy. EU, other partners, can come together and start rebuilding on the very many far more contentious issues today. Love it or hate it, the fact is that capital and technology have globalized the world. You cannot run away from it. You need to build new rules. You need to build new orders around it. Yes, maybe it is time to forget a particular version of globalization, which was the Wall Street version of globalization. But it is time to move on to a new version of globalization. Now, what is that going to be? That is going to be a process of negotiation which, yes, entities within the G20 and various other actors today who are far more stronger than they were many years ago, far more powerful, will need to renegotiate. Thank you.
I'd like to come back to that point, Sanjay, on the fact that it isn't just other countries joining around the table, but other stakeholders. So hang on to that. Well, I'd like to move to Volker Perthes from Germany and ask you, I guess a couple of related questions on the theme of our panel, which is, does the European Union and the core, Germany and France, have the potential, does it speak with the same voice around these big tables? And second, does it play the role as the third and only power, power we have that might counterbalance a US-China confrontation?
Well, it's interesting, Rohinton, how you sort of tried to phrase your question in three different ways, and it's very understandable. You said, do you have the potential? And then, yes, that would be a clear yes, we have the potential. Then when you came to do we speak the same voice, my yes would be much less clear. We speak sometimes with the same voice, but not the same language, and in the same language, not the same grammar. Maybe that is because now, even in the European Union, we have one common language, which is bad English. Even after Brexit, that seems to be our common language. But honestly, in a way, the Trump presidency has woken Europe up. And the response to Trump's America First and his unprecedented way of seeing his allies in Europe as foes, as Jim explained, has created a discourse in Europe around concepts which we didn't take very serious in the past: European sovereignty, strategic autonomy. I think it's a right discourse. So if you speak about language, yes, we speak the same language, but we don't fill it with the same content yet. The basic question, I think, for Europe is whether we actually will be rule makers in that world or whether we are rule takers. And so far, except for some of the, may I say so, less sexy issues in international relations, which are technical standards and trade, where we do set some rules, we are more probably on data also, which is becoming more and more interesting. We are still mainly on the rule-taking side, but I think we have the potential to change that. And the data issue shows that even in the new spheres of politics, once the Europeans stand together and reach out to others, we can change some of the basic rules in the world and make others think whether they want to align with us or whether they have better ideas which we could discuss. I think there are, to put it in a little bit on an abstract way, there are three ways we have to go forward. The one is actually building our strength. That includes military strength, even though that is not the first instrument we want to use in the world. And I could say, in a way, thanks to President Trump, you hinted to that, defense spending in Europe is actually up. That is not because we want to separate from the US or want to have a European Union that would think of going it alone in the world, but we have realized that if your ally doesn't really trust you, you probably build your own strength in the alliance and build up the European pillar of NATO. There's a lot of miles to go, but I think Europe is on the right way here. And I'm not sure what's going to come out of it, but since President Macron of France has actually, for the first time in French history, offered a dialogue about France's strategic weapons to the other Europeans, and some of the other Europeans, including my own country, have said we accept this dialogue, I think at least intellectually and hopefully politically that will bring us forward in Europe. Second point is using the strength which we already have. Europe is the biggest internal market in the world, and that gives us enormous influence on the data thing, on other things. And what we have not yet learned is to use this strength, the strength of our economy, of our common market, in order to bring forward political issues, even geopolitical issues. Again, learning from President Trump probably doesn't seem very attractive, but he is a grand issue linker. I mean, he links different issues together He wants certain political aims to push forward, and he uses trade as a means to threaten others. I'm not saying we should follow him, but we should sometimes at least indicate that for countries who want privileged access to the European market, we have certain demands, and there are certain things which we do not like in their behavior, and we could withdraw, not punish them, but probably withdraw privileges. And one of the issues that I find of particular concern, we raised it in our more private discussion, is the issue of sanctions. Now, here is the biggest internal market, the biggest common market in the world, and we are still not able to maintain legitimate trade with a country in our neighborhood, with Iran, once the United States have decided to sanction that trade. That is ridiculous. And I think many of our companies, CEOs, are not only seeing today that the European Union is passing regulations and what is licit and what is not licit, but in the end they will comply with US demands of not doing trade with a country like Iran. Now, it's only a small country. It's not really important economically for us. But I think many companies are thinking about the situation where the United States would probably put sanctions on trade with China, and China would put sanctions on companies that don't work with China or that don't work with the Belt and Road Initiative. So here, I think Europe really has to find out and has to make use of the strength, of the influence of the market it already has, and said, if we have the biggest market in the world, it shouldn't be others in the world who decide whom we do trade with. We have to politicize in a way or make political use of that big market. And the third thing, I'll finish with that, is Europe has to learn to set priorities. We want everything in the world. We want the good for everything and for ourselves, but we are not strategically prioritizing issues. I think our British colleagues were better at that, certainly, than the Germans, but unfortunately they have left us. So maybe we have to go to school again, finding out that if you want to be strategic, start out by setting your own priorities, because if you don't do it, others will set the priorities for you.
And Minister Vedrin, I would like to come back to you because we're on the theme of Europe coming into its own in some ways. Volker gave the example of increased strategic military cooperation within Europe. I'd add on the trade side, by the way, the European very interesting proposal when the dispute resolution mechanism sort of fell apart for a parallel one to be created, everyone but the US. That's a European initiative with great promise. You mentioned standards and data. The GDPR is something many countries, mine included, look up to you for as leaders. And on sanctions, you have sort of created or tried to your own payment system. So these are examples that one might use to say Europe is indeed a neglected third power here. And I'd like your reaction on whether you see it that way or not.
D'abord,
what you have said, I am in full agreement with what you said just now. Germany, German views, and French unofficial views, German views and French views are in agreement fully. On strategic issues, you touched upon strategic issues. Now, nuclear deterrence, basic principles is that deterrence would have to have the effective deterrence. And ambiguous democratic thinking. to say that deterrence is something that is similar to other weapons. And if this is to be expanded to other countries, then this deterrence is not going to be effective anymore. It's not going to be having any power. President Macron overcame this problem very well. Basic principles of deterrence was maintained, but at the same time, to his European partners, starting with Germany and with other countries, he said that let's look at strategic issues together. To identify where the threats are 20, 30 years down the road, who is going to be the threat. He proposed to think about those things together with his partners in Europe. European countries were very passive, not so forthcoming to his proposal by President Macron. That is because they were being protected by the United States. They didn't want to face a dilemma, but their thinking has started to change. And now strategic dialogue is about to start. This is a new and important development. On sanctions, this has just started. Payment mechanism, an alternative one, is still not strong enough. But this is a matter of how you look at it. European countries must be firm in standing up to the United States. We are friends, we are allies, but this is going too far. That is what Europeans will have to say to the United States. And to do so, you need to have competence and means on par with the United States. It's not doing something that is a guerrilla-like approach. It's just a matter of having normal relations. And new good developments are underway. It's just started, but the trend is a very good one. And US-China, their relations in the future. In Europe, strategic thinking has started. So I think we should be comforted by the fact that such strategic thinking has started in Europe.
Ambassador Rong, Singapore has traditionally played an outsized role in regional affairs and sometimes global affairs as well. And from where you sit, in Singapore, but also in the ASEAN region, I would like your reaction to the broad question that's animating us on the question of US-China rivalry and where that leaves ASEAN.
Thank you. For Singapore, we are a very small country, and although our economy is quite sizable, at the end of the day, we really depend on the bigger countries and the wider world for our own advancement. But if you look at the world order today, the basic issue is over what we call the political and the value system. And as we have gone through the last 2 days, no matter how you look at it, it is between what we have in America, open society, participatory process, yeah, and the role of the people in making choices and policy, and a more different political system in China. So going forward, yeah, the countries in Southeast Asia, in Singapore, we will have to try to avoid taking side on this debate on how do we deal with governance and value. The second thing that we consider is really, at the end of the day, to have a world order, what we know today and what people think should be changed. Actually, you need three things now. Rules, yeah, more and more information, which we call data. And now, because we are so globalized and supply chain has gone to different parts of the world, the market access. So no matter how we debate and maneuver, we will have to have rules. We will have to find a way to manage the information and data flow, and how we move our goods and services across different boundaries. And if we continue to emphasize the underlying principles and values of this liberal world order that we know, there will always be this conflict between the Chinese system and the US system. So how do we go forward? The smartest thing to do in Singapore and ASEAN is we don't take side. But it's not possible nowadays. You cannot say, I don't take side. So we thought maybe we go back to basic principle. Yeah, whatever we do, we need rules. Whatever we want, we need information. And now with technology in such a rapidly changing state, we really have to get more ideas about what each of these new technology portends for our own society and our own business. And number three, having an open market for us to buy and sell. So some of us in our academic circle feel that we should try to de-emphasize the ideological aspect and just focus on the business-like elements. Yeah. But the fact is that the world is not so simple. It's always about philosophy and way of life. And as we now continue to talk about economic and business, it is always inevitable that the philosophies and principles in governing our society will come into play. And so going forward, we advocate maybe more sharing and working together by giving and taking. How do we do that? This coronavirus that we witnessed these last few months show that we really cannot avoid getting to work with each other and cooperate more substantively and more meaningfully. But for Singapore, as a small country, we just have to work with other bigger neighbors, and we have Indonesia here. We try to work together, and as a grouping for Southeast Asia, we try to put across some of our views, and hopefully we can get some traction, and it matters a little bit if we can avoid massive disruption and adjusting to changes a little bit here and there, and hopefully minimizing the kind of instability that will come from the debate that we have heard in the last 2 days, the bigger debate, the bigger challenge between the Western and the not-so-Western way of organizing our society.
Ambassador Fujisaki, you've actually served in Washington, and so had an inside sense as a non-American of how that system works. And on the question of values, I'd say, even though it might not be as sharp as the US-China divide, there was a time not so long ago in the 80s when one heard similar things about Japan, that there was a Japan Inc. approach to economic policy. How could one compete with that? This was fundamentally values. Before the US-China confrontation, many people were worried about the US-Japan confrontation. Along similar lines, that Japan was rising a bit too much and so on. And we came out of it. And Japan, as this conference shows, is absolutely an ally and an anchor in recreating these global rules. And I'd ask you to sort of reflect on the role Japan is playing and could play.
Thank you very much. First, maybe my point is a little bit out of tune, but I do not agree too much with this US-China decoupling that now US as the leader is challenged by China, who is a challenger, the Thucydides trap theory of Alison Graham. I think this is a little deceiving or illusion. In reality, if we remember what was there 30 years ago, 40 years ago, Soviet Union had its camp of almost 1/3 of the world, but it was done only by Soviet tanks. Now China is claiming that China way is there, but it's only done by China money, not by Chinese philosophy or ideology. I think thanks to President Trump, world has learned that China can move. It's possible to move China. But also, because of Mr. Trump, China is finding a breathing space because he's not pushing China with allies. He's just doing it by himself. So China is claiming that, hey, I'm the leader of the free world, Chinese ways there. Not many people are really believing, but because of China money, they're pretending to really buy that, not buy, but sort of nodding partly to that argument. I think that's the reality. And now, in view of that, we shouldn't be trying to find the sort of middle way of American way and China way, or American rules and China rules. What we have now is not only American rule, that's the international rule that we have, not only America, but Europe and Asian countries have developed together. And Chinese way is not really a Chinese way. It's just that they are claiming. I think that distinction has to be clearly kept in mind. But that means also we have to note that all the international organizations after 70 years are rusted. WTO is rusted, UN is rusted. UN, why? Only the nuclear powers is in the driving seat of UN Security Council. WTO, with 164 countries, how can a consensus be made? No decision has been made in the last 25 years. So we have to look at those things as well. Now, talking about Japan's experience, I think, yes, we have been seen as sort of threatening US trade because at that time, our percentage of US trade deficit was 70%. Now China is only 46%, so we were bigger in that sense in the trade deficit area. However, two things are very different. We were dependent totally on security issues and also on technology. Really, US had an edge. We only had edge like Walkman. That's not a huge thing, very frankly. Very frankly. And I think there was leeway for Japan. That was investment. Toyota, Honda, Canon, all invested into United States. But will United States now, in this condition, would like to have Chinese investment into United States? I think if China doesn't change its course, I think it's very difficult. So, but there's a room, I think, because China facing Corona, facing Hong Kong, facing this trade deficit, trade issues, may realize that they cannot just go on with that way, all the way. And I think this is most important, that we all should tell to them that this is the right time. Maybe my way is a little too optimistic and maybe a little out of tune of what some people are discussing, but I think this is the how we have to be telling, not to discuss with China, hey, let's sit down and find a new way, but now you have to really come along with us and really make the rusted international institutions a little bit more spick and span together. Thank you very much.
Minister Wiryuda, I'd like to sort of ask you to pick up where the ambassador left off on 2 points. One is how large is this divide in values between US and China, and is it bridgeable? And second, is this the moment that it might be bridgeable, because there's a number of things coming at China which might lead it to change?
US-China divisions or conflict, I think still bridgeable. One clear example which I mentioned earlier is on the sanctions by President Trump to address the tariff issue. There was a negotiation, there was an agreement, though perhaps not substantial enough, but it's a good sign. If they can do dialogue, they can talk, as sensitive as a trade war, they can make agreements. So multiplies the agreements and intensify the talks might help bridge the US-China divisions. Is it now the momentum? Not during the elections or the election of President Trump, but we might hope that if Trump is elected, the second term might allow him to have a rather free space to deal with China in more peaceful manner. So don't rule out that dialogue and talks could help address the division between the two. I think as stiff as President Xi Jinping, I think Xi Jinping has been quite patient. He didn't give his comments much. He's, of course, very confident of his own position as more or less presidents for life of China, unlike Trump, which is somewhat has to worry about whether he is re-elected or not. But the more confident China is also a positive factor in the future talks or dialogue between the US and China.
Jim, the thesis that there are forces at play that might move China, and that if President Trump is re-elected, he might be free or loosen up. Is this a scenario that gives you hope?
It's hard for me to say because I'm not sure I understand the scenario going forward. So maybe if I get the minister to spell it out a bit, then I'd be happy to comment on it.
Of course, it's difficult to spell it out, but to me, I have rather pessimistic view. If President Trump is elected, that he will change the way he deals with China. But normally in the second term, if he's reelected, on other sensitive issues, like, for example, Palestine-Israeli dialogue or negotiation, normally in the second term, any president will have more space to address the difficult issue. So that's what I said, that perhaps the election of Trump could provide a space for more dialogue. But I believe as China, though is now the superpower, China has long, good traditions, being a country of 1,000 years of civilizations. I think we still can persuade China to dialogue. In relation to issues dealing with Southeast Asia, for example, on conflict in South China Sea, from my series of dialogue with China, I believe that matters like South China Sea, rather than provoking China by challenging China, I think still the best way is to conduct dialogue, and China listens.
My best guess, as I sort of look at what a second Trump term might be able to do in terms of China, is that the president will continue to face the same structural challenges that he currently faces. If you look at the efforts by the administration to put pressure on China, what the administration very quickly discovered is that China had ways to push back against the United States. And I think that's one of the reasons why we ended up with the phase one deal rather than the more ambitious restructuring that was laid out in some of the administration's early talking points. And here I think it's important to draw a distinction between the negotiations with China versus, let's say, the negotiations or the renegotiation of the U.S.-South Korea trade agreement or the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, where the United States had considerable, and I think one-sided leverage to be able to force a deal. Plus, I think it's fair to say that much of the text of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement really imported the things that Mexico and Canada had previously agreed to under TPP. But I think that in the China sense, the president faces the same obstacles. And this goes back, I think, a further challenge, and you alluded to it, Rohinton, and Ambassador Fujisaki alluded to it, which is that even if President Trump picked the right battle in pushing China, he doesn't necessarily have the right strategy. And here's the importance of bringing your friends and allies along with you. And again, the president is skeptical of multilateralism. It's not his nature. I will note, as you pointed out, Rohinton, that the president, by speaking loudly and banging on the table early on in his presidency, actually caught the attention of friends and allies who wanted to work. But I think particularly in the case of China, but not solely in the case of China, the administration was not interested in essence, using the leverage that its own approach and rhetoric and basically strong message had produced. And so one of the things I worry about is if you look at the phase one trade deal, to the extent that the numerical targets can be hit in terms of what the Chinese will buy from the United States, that China will go about doing that by buying less from America's friends and allies, which actually builds tension sort of rather than allowing us to bring sort of common cause against China. The other thing that I will point out in terms of American domestic politics, and I think this is important to carry with everyone, is that I think there's a fairly broad consensus in the United States across the Democrat-Republican divide that the United States should be putting pressure on China to change its behavior on trade, and that is not going to go away if President Trump is doesn't win re-election. But I would note actually, and I think one thing to keep in mind in terms of U.S.-Chinese relations, that if a Democrat wins, not only will you likely to see continued pressure on the trade front, but I actually think on a variety of other issues, U.S.-China relations can be much more difficult and contentious. Again, if you think of the Trump administration, it has not put a high priority on human rights in China's domestic behavior. It has been largely silent on Hong Kong. It has been largely silent on the treatment of the Uyghurs in Western China. I think if you look at the Democratic Party, the Democratic base, human rights groups are much more important. So I would imagine if you have a Democratic administration a year from now, you're likely to see a lot more criticism of China. And I think if there's one thing that Beijing has made clear is it doesn't like criticism of its domestic policies and domestic behavior. So I would urge people not to assume that if in fact administrations change in November, that somehow we're entering into a new period of greater peace and harmony in U.S.-Chinese relations.
So you don't think the traditional argument about he no longer has to seek re-election plays out here?
No, for the following reason. One, in terms of negotiations, presidents always have a great deal of leeway, particularly if they are willing to pay a political cost for what they do. I think if you look at how President Trump has interpreted U.S. trade law in his first term, he has shown that he is willing to interpret the powers he has far more broadly than any previous president has done. I mentioned at the beginning the imposition of tariffs on America's closest allies on national security grounds, no less. This is a very expansive reading of what the U.S. tax law, U.S. trade law allows, and I think it is not one that any previous president has made. But again, the challenge the president has confronted in terms of translating his expansive interpretation of his authority into results is that depends upon what kind of leverage he actually has in the bargaining table. In the case of U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, he had considerable leverage and was able to get a number of things. But in terms of dealing with the Chinese had a lot of reverse leverage, which is limited. I think that's going to govern the nature of any second Trump term more than whether Congress is going to get in the president's way. One caveat in that, of course, is that if the president does get a big deal that requires changing American law, then he has to go to Capitol Hill. And then, of course, the question is going to be what's actually in that deal. And I will point out one of the reasons why the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement was passed by Congress is because Democrats got a lot of what they wanted in that deal. So the nature of the executive legislative contest on any China deal, if one is required, is going to depend upon what is in that deal.
And as we noted in our private discussions, China hasn't at all played the international finance card in any way. It keeps buying U.S. debt. It is not making all that much noise in global institutional reform and so on. So you're right about there being some ammo if it chose to use it. Sanjay, so we have U.S.-China, we have other countries that might play in and make a difference, and you've alluded to the fact that it might not just be other countries. Help us understand which other stakeholders might help change the U.S.-China equation.
First of all, you have to look at the way supply chains have got enmeshed and integrated in today's world. Whether it's in the US, whether it is in EU, whether it is in China, or in countries like India and Vietnam. You are living in the world of supply chains. The interests are very, very closely intertwined. So within each country, within each constituency, there are elements which play out different parts of this negotiation. They gain and lose in different aspects of it. And for countries many times negotiating as outsiders, when they start looking at the US-China conflict, it's sometimes very, very difficult for them to understand and comprehend when they're asked to make a choice. Which part of the so-called US-China standoff is actually a negotiating position, which is simply stuck on a trade issue? Which part of it is a strategic challenge, and which then requires different kinds of negotiations to play out? Now, that is a difficult dilemma for most countries to resolve when they're asked to actually choose between China versus US tech. More and more of the technology debate between the US and China today is being framed in terms of security. Now, being framed in terms of security does not simply mean that it has become a security debate. Many countries still feel that a large part of the security debate is also efforts to try to see how do you build up barriers to competition. Once the barriers to competition, and trade has always worked in this manner. This is not the first time this has happened in trade. This actually also happened in the trade conflict in the 70s and 80s between Japan and the US. We saw a lot of that being played out. So between China and the US, similar questions keep getting asked by other countries who are watching this conflict on the side. That is why taking sides in this is extremely difficult for countries, and they therefore will tend to take on their own negotiating positions. They will want to take their own choices. They will say, I will choose the way which suits my interest best. Because the US is not working with allies, this makes it even more likely.
Mr. Vedrine, a thought on that point, that Western Europe doesn't have multinational digital firms. And so GDPR, in fact, is easy to impose there, because you don't have the political economy of these large firms playing into your political process. US and China are in a standoff. Does this give the European way more of an opportunity in terms of standards, in terms of the way that we establish reform in international organizations?
Je ne sais pas si ça donne des opportunités.
Whether there is such a possibility, I don't know, but what I feel is that European countries must work hard on technology. In this area, we need to regain our sovereignty, because otherwise, standards and rules and regulations, we will not be able to make such regulations. You have to be at the top of technology. So the priority for Europeans is not imposing regulations on others, but first, you have to be at the forefront of innovation, especially in the areas of digital and ecology. You need to stand at the forefront. Batteries, solar power cells, there are various other areas where European countries play the global and open cards. That was in the 1970s that Europeans were playing a global card. They had the intention of having an open system, but others didn't follow. Europe is not closed. So Europeans must work on industry and technology. When we talk about Europe, at the European Commission, this isn't a program that was created at the European Commission. I'm talking about Europe as a whole. The success of Airbus is one such example. It's a European organization supported by European governments, a European unit. So European countries must stand up. It's that timing right now.
There was a time when sort of European innovation and German innovation sort of led to a set of behaviors, I guess. And what the minister is saying is, if you don't have technological prowess, how can you be rule setting? And yet we do see in AI and in GDPR, France has a very sort of sophisticated view on AI governance without necessarily being a leader in AI governance. Ditto for Germany.
Well, I think the minister is right in saying that we have to beef up our technological innovative capacities, but there is one thing more. It is not only being innovative in sort of the engineering part, it is also about marketing the innovations which we make in our countries, and we are not very good at that. And I heard the same complaint from Japanese officials the other days. There is still a lot of inventions coming from Germany, from France, from other European countries, even from countries like Estonia, difficult to find on a map, but quite innovative in technology. And then an American giant comes and buys them and markets them. This is something I guess we could easily change. And again, I mean, we have this huge single market, which would help to market products that come from European innovation. And I think we shouldn't underestimate where we are still strong. In the digital sphere, there are, of course, certain products where American businesses are on top, and that is everything that has to do with let's say, entertainment and including smartphones that are partly used for entertainment. We have Chinese companies that are on top for everything that regards surveillance or sort of trying to streamline societies in a way. When it comes to Industry 4.0, European companies are ahead of others, and I think we need to preserve that. And it is sometimes important to remember that technology is not a value-free thing. Technologies sort of embed certain ideas about how society functions and what state-society relations are, and therefore it's not astonishing that Chinese companies have an advantage when it comes to surveillance, for example, because that is quite important for their political system. And there's also a branch of industry where they don't want any cooperation with German companies, for example. They want to keep that for themselves. And when it comes to communication technologies, next generation 5G, 6G communication, for example, I think the biggest fear for us shouldn't be that there is espionage or sabotage. That's all, well, realities or possibilities. But what kind of state-society model is transported with certain technologies being used large scale in our own societies? And here's a combination of strong standard setting, data protection directive, together with technological innovation, I think is a combination of sort of politics or policies, regulation, and technology that could bring Europe back to the forefront, not in all aspects of innovation, but in one that is very important for humankind and for the way how we structure state-society relations in the future, both inside our countries, but also cross-border communications. Do we want certain companies, certain big companies, to own our data and thereby try to streamline our behavior by playing onto our mobile phones the advertisements which I think correspond to our daily mood? Do we want states to know, state security agencies to know every single move and probably what we think and how we vote? Or do we want citizens to own their own data and decide what to do with them? If we let us guide from this philosophy of that we want citizens to own their own data, then I think that would also give a boost to the kind of technologies which we can produce in our countries. And I think here it is, let me end with this. It sometimes goes unnoticed that Japan and the European Union have created together the biggest zone in the world of free data flows. And that is not because we have been cooperating, we probably should, on future technologies all the time, but because of democratic societies, democratic states that we trust each other that the form of data protection you have in Japan and we have in Europe sort of go along with one another, and then our industries can cooperate, our bureaucracies can cooperate without fear that the data of the other side are misused. So that gives a boost both to technology in both countries, to commerce and trade and industry, but also to the cooperation between democratic countries.
That's a good point, Volker. In fact, the Osaka process, which came out of the G20 summit here on high-quality data, was exactly about that. And so you've anticipated my next question, and we only have about 15 minutes left, so I'm going to ask each of you to spend no more than 2 minutes addressing it. And I'm just going to go down the row and end with you, Ambassador Fujisaki, and start with you, Volker. If we're having this conversation again on recreating or refreshing liberal world order with a US-China sort of duopoly, and then Europe, Japan, the G20 playing either supportive roles or not, I'm simply going to ask all of you to reflect on whether your discourse 10 years from now will be an optimistic one, reflecting on things having more or less worked out, or something much better or much worse.
Did you say 10 years from now? 10. Well, then I'm optimistic. I wouldn't be optimistic in the same way if you had asked me for when we meet here again next year. But as you're asking me when we meet here 10 years from now, yes, I think that things will have improved, that we will have learned from the crises of these years that there simply is no escape from multilateral cooperation. And I think I said yesterday that I am very much in favor of a realistic multilateralism, and the G20 is probably a good start here, where we learn that even though as democracies we can cooperate better together than with non-democracies, we must find formats where for the global challenges to our common future, we also can integrate countries that don't necessarily subscribe to our democratic values. That is what we do in the G20. That is how we have maintained the stability of the financial system in 2008, not by sticking together as democracies and accusing the others of disrupting the system, but by saying that on global challenges we need to cooperate. The same goes for climate change, of course, or for global health.
I would tend to agree with Volker. I would not give it 10 years maybe, perhaps 15 years later down the line. I would be optimistic for the simple reason that even within countries, with different governance systems, we will need to recognize diversity. There is going to be diversity. All democracies are not alike. Some democracies are broken. Some democracies are better than others. So you will have different kinds of status systems who will be coming in, but ultimately, each and every one of them has, perhaps some have millions, some have billions of people to take care of. Their well-being is at the heart of it all. They need to be pragmatic. They need to be open. And that is going to force them ultimately to come together to find solutions to this.
I think the first thing is that we have to clone Kudo-san with his high spirit of talking, sponsoring a discourse on the need to repair, to reform the existing global world order. But of course, learning from the past history of the past 500 years, we should be of high caution, though we should open our mind that perhaps one day when we are consistent with our conversations all over the world about the need for reform, we might be successful. Thank you.
So, Rohinton, the question you have asked us is whether we are pessimistic or optimistic about how things will look 10 years down the road. I immediately think of the great American philosopher Yogi Berra, who reminded us that it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future. I certainly hope to be here in 10 years or 15 years so I can determine whether I am right or I am wrong. I fear that I am more pessimistic than several of the panelists. I guess my philosophy would be to hope for the best but prepare for the worst. I do think that we are going to be facing a lot of challenges for which should make us realize that we need to cooperate and that working together will produce a better outcome for all of us. What I fear is, based on history, that it will take us a long time to get there, and we may not get there in time. I'm particularly concerned in what I consider to be the great threat we face, which is climate change, where I'm not sure that time is as generous as we seem to think in terms of our rather fitful response. And I do worry that a number of the challenges that we face could intensify over that period of time. And there is a potential to be a day late and a dollar short, as we say in the United States, and that would be my great fear. But I would say that I couldn't be happier to come back here in 10 or 15 years if Kudo-san will have me and have all of you tell me I was wrong.
Actually, I feel that we don't have to wait 10 years, yeah? In the next 2 to 3 years, if Donald Trump get re-elected and Xi Jinping stay where he is, these two men will probably strike a deal that can change quite a lot of things. Because they don't accept failure. And what we have seen so far of Donald Trump is a kind of bravado. I'll do it because you think I cannot do it. In the case of Xi, he has to be successful, otherwise his entire objective of making China great again, or the Communist Party to survive, its 100th anniversary in 2021, will all be down the drain. So I think if these two guys live up to their reputation, maybe after the re-election in the United States of America, assuming Donald Trump get re-elected, and Xi Jinping is still there surviving COVID-19 and the potential collapse of his Chinese economy, they will want to do something quite dramatic, if nothing else, to save their own life, political life. Yeah. Rohinton, you talk about the financial system that we have and the support that the Chinese has given to the American Treasury. We think about this a lot in our research. If any development lead to the Chinese deciding that they have to pull the rug. It will be a completely different calculation altogether. So I want to say that I don't think it will take so long. We will know in the next 2 to 3 years whether this liberal world order or this existing scheme of things can survive or not. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm optimistic based on two conditions. One, the United States will come back to have more broad-minded leadership. Second, China. We should unite and tell Chinese people that there's no China way. You cannot do cherry picking. You have to come around and play with the same rule with us. And if on those two conditions, I think I'm pretty optimistic. And lastly, I think if you come back 10 years, you don't see so many masked people. I'm pretty optimistic about it. Thank you.
Mr. Vidrine, last word on that one to you is, are you optimistic or pessimistic 10 years down the road? If we were all invited, what might we be talking about?
Generally speaking, I'm neither a pessimist nor optimist. I try not to be either pessimist or optimist, and I try to think of what is possible.
Les questions dont nous avons parlé.
Today, we have taken up various issues and discussed them, and we can think about various scenarios. Right now, what we are discussing is liberal world order, democratic system. This is not born naturally on its own volition. It did not appear all of a sudden. And before, there was a liberal world order that we have today. A decision was taken by several countries, including the United States, and we are now, based on that extension, and in particular, the United States, President Truman, it was a unique era with no other similar example. It was quite a unique era, and other countries followed. And GATT became WTO in 1995. It was reborn as WTO in 1995, but that required a leadership. So if one is to be optimistic, well, still proper thinking is necessary, and when China faces difficulties or when the US has difficulties, we can use that opportunity, and we have to plan ahead what actions to take. Worldwide leaders, about 10 leaders are here to discuss how the current world order needs to be formed. We need such a framework of discussion. If we engage in these efforts, then the confrontation between the United States and China continuing forever, we can get away from that.
C'est possible.
I think it is possible to achieve that. Earlier, there was an analogy of two elephant giants that I referred to. That was referred to. I think that was an apt analogy. The two elephants, when the elephants collide, other countries are trampled and are put in dangerous situation. So under a leadership, democratic international society must be rebuilt. About 15 countries, the countries that were mentioned, centering around these countries, international order needs to be rebuilt.
Et si ça n'est pas fait, on ne peut pas être optimiste.
However, if that cannot be achieved, then one cannot be optimistic.
I think that's a very apt way to bring this particular discussion to a close. With the importance of exception that Jim made, that we do have questions like climate change and indeed pandemics in which existential issues arise on which if there isn't cooperation, it's a cliff. It's not as if you can muddle through that one. It's nature's telling you something and we should be listening. But the other speakers also made variations around the theme that the current system might be messy and imperfect, but it's better than any of the alternatives. And indeed, if I could project, the US and China have an interest in maintaining it, even though sometimes they would break it, but they still have an interest in it all hanging together. And that's certainly the case for the other 160-odd countries that find themselves outside the US-China zone. We've spent 3 days now thinking about these issues thanks to Genron NPO's organization and Kudo-san's in particular. And we've brought us to this stage where we now have a set of thoughts that I know Kudo-san is going to read to us and then present to the US representative as our thoughts and vision for what the G7 might do in the coming year to bring to fruition some of the things you've heard. But I thought we had a very fruitful discussion from people who've actually been at the table, the two ministers. So thank you all, both of you, for joining us and from giving us your views, having been there and having had to take those decisions and make those trade-offs. And from my think tank friends and the ambassador for analyzing and giving us such a rich way of passing a Sunday afternoon. So thank you all, and on to the next stage.
Thank you very much for the waiting. Now we would now like to have the closing session, the presentation of the joint statement to be submitted to the presidency of the G7. We have two guests to receive the statement from the United States in presidency of G7. We have from the U.S. Embassy in Japan, an acting deputy chief of mission, Mr. Nicholas Hill. And representing the Japanese government, we have the Deputy Director General, Deputy Assistant Minister from the Foreign Policy Bureau of Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Yamanaka. And on behalf of the Japanese government, we were inviting Mr. Suzuki, the State Minister for Foreign Affairs, but because of all the developments, Mr. Yamanaka is here on his behalf. I would like to thank him for coming despite all the recent developments. Now, unfortunately, because of the coronavirus outbreak, the participation from member think tanks from 4 countries had to be cancelled for the Tokyo conference. But based upon the result of the discussion in the past 2 days, having had consulted with those participants who have been absent, we would like to make the public announcement for the joint statement as representing the member think tanks from all the 10 countries. So on behalf of the Tokyo Conference participants, may I ask Mr. Kudo to present the statement. So let me read out the statement. Tokyo Conference 2020 Declaration for the Future. Representatives of leading think tanks from the countries that comprise the Group of 7, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States, as well as India, Singapore, and Brazil, worked together to issue a statement for the Tokyo Conference 2020 held on February 29 and March 1st. This is the fourth round of Tokyo Conference. Despite the spread of the new coronavirus in our neighboring country, representatives of the world's 10 leading think tanks took part in the joint effort by the Tokyo Conference because recent developments require us to renew our resolve and commitment to our values. The economic rivalry between the United States and China has developed into a battle for technological hegemony during the past few years, and the prospects for the liberal international order have become increasingly unclear. The trend toward unilateralism, which is spreading rapidly worldwide, is adversely affecting international cooperation and multilateral consensus building. As was the case with Tokyo Conference 2019, we engaged in discussions on the future of U.S.-China relations because there is a risk that the strategic competition between the two major powers can deepen and last longer than anticipated. The spread of novel coronavirus to the world highlights the fact that countries deepening their interdependencies, where an incident such as this would trigger chain reactions around the world simultaneously. Solution to common issues can only be generated by reciprocal cooperation. However, the future of the liberal international order, which has been sustaining global prosperity to date, is precarious. We must face the possibility that the world economy will be plunged into major disrupting divisions. We are now at a critical juncture when major democracies must unite and launch a new endeavor. What we ultimately aim for is to protect and update frameworks to support the liberal international order. Competition among the world's superpowers should take place within an arena of a rule-based open market, which means that outcome of the current confrontations should not result in the further fractures of the world order, but a new framework for the coexistence between the United States and China and among all the members of the international community should be based on rules and develop under a reinforced liberal international order. Indeed, now is the time for the world's democratic countries to work together for the sake of the world's liberal order. To this end, we, the think tanks from 10 countries, must make proactive contributions. All the member think tanks of the Tokyo Conference 2020 agreed to engage in the discussions according to these statutes of the respective institution. In the last 2 days, we had far-reaching discussions and reached a common understanding on many issues. Out of these issues, the following 5 were highlighted. First, this year's Group of 7 chair the United States is in the midst of presidential election campaign. We strongly hope that the United States will duly weigh its role in the international community and continue to take a strong leadership role as it assumes presidency of the G7. The major democracies, including the other G7 member states, should cooperate to defend the liberal international order and strive to be at the center of that order into the future. To this end, the G7 member states should take the lead in rule-making and in multilateral cooperation to maintain global stability and find solutions to global issues. Second, with the further deepening of the U.S.-China strategic competition, depending on the developments of America's export control regulations based on the entity list and investment reviews, there is a strong likelihood of U.S. allies and other countries being forced to make difficult decisions on all policy issues with relation to security considerations. Nonetheless, the major democracies should maintain solidarity and strive to avert schism in the global economy. On the other hand, China should be prepared to accommodate the principle of reciprocity in economic and trade relations with the rest of the world if it seeks equal access to the global market. We must adopt measures to ensure a level playing field in the global economy while pressuring China to carry out necessary reforms of its domestic economy. But our aim should not be the exclusion of China. Third, rulemaking efforts are not keeping pace with fast-paced technological developments, including the rapid progress of the data-driven economy and artificial intelligence. That said, key actors have undertaken initiatives aimed at creating new rules, as evidenced by the US-Japan Digital Trade Agreement reached last fall, and consultations between Japan and the European Union on similar matters are underway. The G7 should take the initiative in these kinds of efforts and promote their multilateralization within such institutional contexts as the WTO. Striving to protect the liberal international order means that we should take a proactive approach to formulate new rules which could support coexistence of countries under such an order. In this process, we must jointly redefine the liberal order we should strive for. We should all make efforts to include China in the process. Addressing global problems such as climate change and achieving sustainable growth are also urgent issues. Fourth, the G7 member states, which share the common values of individual freedom and democracy, should cooperate in efforts to boost the internal strength of each state at a time when the world is entering a phase of strategic competition. In order for the democracies to defend the liberal international order, we must ensure that our people at home benefit from the fruits of globalization and incentivize sustainable and inclusive growth, both globally and domestically. To this end, we must focus on domestic efforts to enhance our competitiveness, which may include proactively promoting education, infrastructure investment, and technological advancement. Fifth, the G7 states should strive to make their respective democratic systems more resilient in order to contain the growing tendency toward authoritarianism and populism on display in many democracies. We must rebuild a problem-solving cycle of democratic institutions and restore public trust in representative democracy. It is also necessary to reinforce the checks and balances systems as well as the rule of law, and more importantly, to defend a society where citizens have the right to self-determination. In accordance with this view, intellectuals, independent media organizations, and think tanks must contribute to this effort. This historic challenge upon which the fate of freedom and democracy hinges can be won only by seeking broad public support from all over the world. March 1, 2020, the Tokyo Conference.
Thank you very much. May we invite Mr. Nick Hill, Acting Deputy Chief of Mission. Mr. Hill, President Kudo, please come to the center. Thank you very much. On behalf of the government of Japan, may we invite Deputy DG Mr. Yamanaka. Please come forward to the center of the stage. Thank you very much. The presidency of this year's G7, on behalf of the United States, may we invite Acting DCM, Mr. Nick Hill. As we face numerous challenges as the presidency of G7 in 2020, what is the United States trying to achieve? The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to join you today. To Kudo-san, President of Genron NPO, and to all the organizers, thanks very much for inviting me to provide remarks this afternoon. I'm honored to address such a distinguished audience. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the challenge we are currently facing with the coronavirus, or COVID-19, and briefly touch upon our ongoing collective response to the situation. The U.S. government has been very active protecting the welfare of U.S. citizens in Japan. We extend our thanks to the government of Japan for its invaluable collaboration. And we remain committed to working alongside Japan and all our international partners to address this rather unprecedented situation. The United States has the honor to host the 46th G7 summit this year. We Americans are practical people, and we view our presidency as an opportunity to bring the G7 back to basics, to focus on key economic issues that are at the core of the G7. That means our priority for the summit will be to emphasize what the G7 was founded to do: stimulate economic growth and promote global prosperity. There is often the temptation to load these meetings with so many issues and topics that it is difficult to know what our priorities are. Again, ours are very clear: working together for economic growth and economic prosperity. I'm afraid I will have to keep all of you in somewhat suspense about the details, because I'm not going to be saying much more than that at this time. I certainly don't want to get ahead of any White House announcements, which will be coming soon with more detailed information regarding the Leaders' Summit. Much of the attention around the G7 is understandably on the Leaders' Summit. But of course, preparations are also underway for the Foreign Ministers meeting later this month and the Finance Ministers meeting in April. These are also very important gatherings. Today's gathering is also important. You have worked to craft recommendations, which I will forward to the White House. It is not so easy to bring together representatives of think tanks from 10 nations to develop a document all can agree on, or at least live with. As we talk about the G7, it is really part of a broader conversation about multilateralism, the rules-based multilateral world order, and broad international engagement. There is a lot of talk and a lot of worry about this topic these days, and a lot of talk amongst all of you. That is really why I'm here today. I want to make absolutely clear that the United States remains fully engaged with our international partners, and that we value such engagement. We even value the arguments. We value international rules. This is what has enabled our economies to flourish. At the same time, we expect others to follow international rules as well, and we should not be afraid to modernize these rules. Recently, there has been much talk about the United States and our commitment to the multilateral system, and I wanted to take this time to clarify our position. In February, Secretary of State Pompeo addressed this very topic during a speech at the Munich Security Conference. He spoke of how in recent years, democratic leaders have questioned America's commitment to multilateralism. He proceeded to give concrete examples of how the United States continues in its traditional role as a global leader. To name a few, we have worked with our international partners, and importantly, our Japanese allies, on global sanctions to prevent North Korea from continuing development of its nuclear weapons program. And we have worked hard to bring Pyongyang back to the negotiating table. We have raised the alarm on China's unfair trading practices, the Chinese Communist Party's aggressive new turn, and its campaign of economic coercion that threatens the sovereignty of developing nations. We have worked diligently to deprive the Islamic Republic of Iran of diplomatic sanctuary and the financial ability to fuel its campaign of terror. We are also leading by example on the environment. The International Energy Agency's latest global emissions report found that America's energy-related CO2 emissions declined by 2.9% in 2019, even while the U.S. economy achieved significant growth. We continue to work with Japan and the European Union on ways to reform the World Trade Organization, strengthen existing WTO rules on industrial subsidies, and promote the importance of market-oriented conditions for a free, fair, and mutually advantageous trading system. Then there are our efforts to advance our shared vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific. This involves mobilizing private sector investment in regional infrastructure which we're pursuing with like-minded allies. Most recently, the United States, Japan, and Australia jointly announced the Blue Dot Network, a branding and certification mechanism aimed at elevating sustainable projects that meet international quality standards. These are just a few of the signature efforts of the United States working with partners to exercise global leadership. And I ask you, does this sound like an America that rejects the international community? Are these the actions of an America which has cast off the mantle of global leadership? In all our initiatives, we're committed to recruiting allies. It is true that we value our sovereignty, just as we value the sovereignty of all nations. And we continue to protect our own sovereignty and the sovereignty of our neighbors in a multilateral context. Before I wrap up, I'd briefly like to touch upon trade. A theme of this conference is U.S.-China confrontation, which sounds a little harsh to me. Certainly the United States wants a good relationship with China. We all do. And toward that goal, the United States is successfully working to achieve a fair and reciprocal trade relationship with China. In our recently signed Phase 1 trade deal, the United States and China reached a meaningful and enforceable agreement. The agreement achieves reforms and other changes to China's economic and trade regime in important areas like in intellectual property, technology transfer, and agriculture, among others. Though not all issues were resolved in this round, it was an important step, and there will be more to follow. This is good news, and it's good news for all of China's trading partners. And I would want to stress, it's also even good news for China. Let me conclude on that positive note and thank again the organizers for inviting me this afternoon to speak. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hill, ADCM. Last but not least, I would like to ask the former ambassador to the United States and the member of World Agenda Council, Ambassador Ichiro Fujisaki, to give closing remarks. I would like to say a few words in closing. We just had a discussion of the upcoming summit. Well, close to 2 decades ago, there was an Evian summit in France and Sea Island Summit, and for those summits, I served as Sherpas, and I was recalling that experience. When there was an NPO like Genron NPO back then, contributing wisdom with other think tanks, then statements from the summit could have been a better statement. I hope that the outcome, based on the wisdom of many people, will be utilized by the summit participants. And secondly, this is similar to what I have said yesterday. Former French Foreign Minister, Minister Vedrin, and former Indonesian Foreign Minister, Hassan Virayuda, took part in the panel discussion, and we were able to have a great discussion. And we received keynote speeches from the ministers, also from the former Federal President of Germany, President Wolf. Democracy, multilateralism that we are discussing, how can we advance democracy and multilateralism? We were able to listen to insights. And think tank participants had been engaged in discussion for 3 days, starting from Friday. Yesterday, despite Japan imposing more controls on coronavirus situation, conference was held, and for that I'm very appreciative. And participants who took part yesterday and today, and former UN Undersecretary General Mr. Akashi, and Excellencies, thank you very much for taking your time to take part in the conference. Mr. Kudo is determined to continue his efforts. So I would like to ask for your continuous support of Genron NPO. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Fujisaki. This will be the end of the Tokyo Conference 2020, organized by Genron NPO. I would like to thank all the panelists and speakers who have participated for the past few days. Thank you very much. Once again, a big applause to all of them, please.